Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second in a four-part series, Creating an Inclusive Academic Medicine Environment. I'm Dr. Jessica Seaman, Academic Success Consultant for Creighton GME and co-chair of the Alliance Faculty Development Committee here in Phoenix. Today, we're excited to have Dr. Erika Kirby with us. She will be presenting Teaching Across Social Identities. We'll explore creating inclusive academic environments respectful of all social identities while expanding on the ideas introduced in our September session by Drs. Johnson and Vivekanandan. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce Dr. Kirby a little more formally. This session is being recorded for future reference, and you will have access to both the video and the slide presentation. We invite you to submit any questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can by the end of the session. We do ask that you remain muted with video off unless asking a live question, which we do welcome, to assist with the recording. Also, this session is eligible for continuing education, and we thank you in advance for providing any feedback through that continuing education. You will be asked to submit a survey. So we appreciate any feedback that you give us through that survey. Dr. Erika Kirby is a professor of Communication Studies and the A.F. Jacobson Chair in Communication at Creighton. She is also a senior facilitator for the Anti-Defamation League. She studies the intersections of working and personal life, emphasizing how differing social identities, including race, class, and gender, intersect with organizational structures. She co-edited 2 editions of Gender Actualized and is currently teaching Being Color Brave, Race, Privilege, Oppression, and Justice on Creighton's Omaha campus. We're grateful Dr. Kirby graciously agreed to share her time and wisdom with us today. So, Dr. Kirby, if you're ready, I'll turn the time over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Seaman. Hi, everyone. If I haven't met you, Erika Kirby in the Communication Studies Department, and also a senior facilitator for the Anti-Defamation League. And I just wanted to re-emphasize that because of the fact that a lot of how I teach this is inspired by being a trainer for the ADL. And so if a source comes from there, I'll sort of just acknowledge it along the way. So let's start talking about teaching across social identities. I have 4 objectives that I'm hoping we can accomplish in about 40 minutes to be able to define social identity and what it means to teach across social identities, to define ethnocentrism, white-mindedness, and their relation to teaching and learning, to expand on the concept of cultural humility, which was introduced in session 1, and to offer communication-centered practices for teaching more inclusively, which is also a facet of cultural humility. So, defining social identities. I first just wanted to put, and you will have these slides, so no need to note take, but a couple definitions about how identity gets defined. And the first one is from the ADL where I train. The qualities, beliefs, or affiliations that make up a particular person or group positioned in relation to other people or groups. And I sort of said that in relation with emphasis because we talk about social locations with social identities. Another definition, who you are, the way you think about yourself, the way you are viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define you was the definition of yourdictionary.com. And I just sort of liked the simplicity of that one. So we have a few basic definitions. I'm going to have us look at how this sometimes visually gets represented in terms of how people look at identities in combination. So the first one, and I'm just calling these social identities and social locations, and we'll have a 1 and 2. If you've seen diversity wheels, this is sort of a common representation of what you might see, where in the center are, if I was born in a certain year, I am a certain age, and that might be a little more immutable than my education, for example. So it has in the center ways that we, so our core identities, and then around the circle, other things though that we may have in terms of identities that end up being ways that people view us And on all of these, I want to emphasize that let's just start with, if I chose socioeconomic status as and maybe you can see me circling it here, the little yellow one right here, it's a continuum, right? And it's a continuum of privileged identities to more marginalized, and people can fall in between. So to see it in this wheel, I also need us to understand that each part of it is almost like a piece of pie, right? Whereas you come closer to the center, you have a more centered and powerful identity. And as you go further out, that might be more toward the margins. So with all of these, we think about what is the identity, and then with that continuum, what is my social location on that continuum? So I grew up relatively poor and started off on the center, but now, teaching this many years at Creighton, it has come more towards the center. That's how we would think about looking at it in this wheel format. Just going to give you another second just to look, because I'm going to have you, after I show a couple of these slides, pick your two most central identities. So identity and social locations 2. Maybe you've seen this one as well, where they talk about identity and then how our identities sort of bridge out. So my core identities that are internal. And then what does that look like in terms of how I'm placed in community with nation of origin or education or my geographic location? And then how does that look in terms of my social life experiences and maybe even the institutional dimensions of where I'm at? How does my role as faculty member impact my social location? So I wanted to give you a couple ways of how that is typically represented, but then have us just think a little bit more deeply about how we sort of look at people in terms of their identities and maybe even judge in terms of those identities. So I want to credit the ADL. They have a mini lesson on the Identity Iceberg that I can refer anyone to if they want, but that is where this came from. When I teach about identity, I often do it through this metaphor of an iceberg, which says like, what is above the waterline that we know, what's at the waterline that we think we know, and what's below the waterline that we still might think we know, but we really can't know unless we ask people these questions. So things like the fact that I'm wearing a green sweater and I have a nose ring and I have a braided headband, like you can see those, right? Those are factual about me. Like if I put my hands here, you might assume that I'm married because I have a ring here, but it's a tiny little ring and I'm not, right? So we look at markers on people at the waterline sometimes to think about some of these aspects of identity and make some guesses. You probably have guesses as to age by looking at me, those sorts of things. And then below the waterline are things that we, again, can't really know, but that sometimes people make assumptions about, right? If you've ever heard anyone say something like my gaydar went off, that is making an attribution about sexual orientation, that it's an above the waterline thing, but we don't really know unless we ask that question. And so in introducing this iceberg as metaphor, I just want to put out there this notion that I put in print here. If we would not want others to make assumptions about our identities, we shouldn't make assumptions about theirs, because we really only know what's above the waterline. Otherwise, we ask and or wait to be told, right? Some of these things that would feel very strange to ask, but we still shouldn't assume unless we know for sure. So with that, to be able to teach across social identities, the most basic thing is to understand our own social location, our own identities. And so put a couple questions here, and we're actually going to answer one on Menti. We'll be using that program today. Which of my social identities are most important to me, and how might that influence my interactions? So if I do identify as a woman, if that is most important to me, how does that influence my interactions? Whatever you think. What else do I need to learn about my own social identity groups? And another question to ask ourselves, have I experienced discomfort while interacting with members of other social identity groups? And if I have, to sort of push myself on why is that? So we'll do our first sort of point of interaction right now to keep this so it's not just me talking to you for the full 40 minutes. If you go to www.menti.com, which you see on top, and I'm certain you've probably used this by now since it's been more prevalent since the pandemic, and you use the code 42643841. I showed you a lot of potential identities, and I'm just asking, consider all of the potential identities introduced on these slides. Enter 2 that are very important to you. And so once you enter those and hit submit, we should start seeing things show up on the screen. And we do. We have 53 friends on, so I'll wait till we have a critical mass. And from now on, it'll get a lot faster because you'll just advance slides, right? Versus having to look it up. The first one's always the waiting game while people are getting it set, that technology set up on their phones or computers. We have 15 out of 53. I might hold out till we get at least 20, just so I know people are going to start to be ready for forthcoming questions. So we see that woman, female, mother is emerging strongly. Father's on here as well, married. So it looks like our identities in terms of relation to career, relation to education, and relation to whether or not people have kids is something that emerged pretty strongly. And then we also need to consider our student identities and whether or not we're making assumptions there. Am I making assumptions about my students' social identities? How might the social identities of my students be impacting their daily life experiences? It's a question that sometimes I forget to ask myself. And what else do I need to learn about my students' social identity groups? So for those that are teachers, when we do teach, like what are those questions? And how can we grow our empathy to be able to know more about those student experiences by listening to, reading, watching stories of people that might have those identities who might not be like us. This is going to be way easier and faster. You don't have to type a word. So I'm hoping I get more than 15 friends to just answer this question. I have made an assumption about someone's social identity or identities in my work in academic medicine in the past 2 weeks. Okay. Trending towards agrees and strongly disagrees that people have made assumptions. And making an assumption and articulating that assumption are different things, right? But if we don't check our bias, it might be then that we act on that assumption versus just having it happen, which is a central thing that we train about in anti-bias training. And you'll have a slide on it later, like we all have bias, period, end of story. But whether or not we act on that bias is a very different thing, right? So it might even be that like we start to have this assumption come in, but whether or not that translates to action is another way to think about it. Great. And one more thing to think about with considering student identities, what preconceived notions or stereotypes do I have about my students based on social identity characteristics, whether we seem different or similar, right? Because when we seem similar, then I also might have this orientation that I don't think that much about. Are these preconceptions positive, negative, neutral? What's their source? And will these preconceptions facilitate or impede interacting with these students? So questions to ask ourselves. So now that we know what identity is and sort of have this frame of there's continuums on all of them, some are more privileged, some are more marginalized, we have different locations. Think about what barriers are to teaching across those social identities. And I'm going to introduce this idea of ethnocentrism and white-mindedness as barriers and have us just answer some questions. So you'll see on this, thinking about these barriers, with ethnocentrism and white-mindedness, we'll talk about fear of open conflict, defensiveness, right to comfort, and either or thinking. And the source is on here. And I'll show you sort of these behaviors of white culture in general. There's more of them that are on our last slide, but I wanted you to be able to have the source to go to it. So we think about ethnocentrism. It is when, and it's probably not a new word, but evaluating others according to preconceptions originating in standards and customs of our own cultural identity group. So I evaluate others based on how we do things in my culture. It's a standpoint or place from which people of a cultural group look at themselves, at others, and at society. And in this process, privileged identities set the standard and become the cultural group by which others are judged and imply a hierarchy of human values. So back to thinking about identity and how we have, for a given identity, right, there's a continuum, and the more privileged set the standards of, well, this is what it means to be a male, or this is what it means to be, we can fill in the blanks, right? And in that hierarchy of human value, if we get to that point, we actually basically say some people are worth more than others based on the identities that they hold. And so, quick question. I have ethnocentrically evaluated my students or those I work with at some point. This is the way we do things, and they do things differently, and that's not the way we do things. It's kind of a hard one to put out there. So thank you for answering. Okay, a lot of people agree that this has probably happened at least at some point. I'm going to, just for the purposes of illustration, again, build on this concept, especially given the statistics that we saw in session 1 about sort of what the makeup in terms of ethnic and racial makeup of medicine is, looking at ethnocentrism and whiteness. So if we're thinking about those 3 parts of the definition of ethnocentrism, interlaced with thinking about whiteness, what would that look like? So it's a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. So white people don't always think of themselves as being racialized subjects. Sometimes for white people, we can categorize all the other races and then sort of don't think about, oh yeah, but that means I'm also a racialized subject and not just what everything else is in contrast to. So that's the first one. Second, it's a location of structural advantage. Whiteness is a place of race privilege when we think about the hierarchy of human value based on race, at least in the United States and in many places. And it's a standpoint, a place from which white people look at ourselves, at others, and at society. So BIPOC people, and if you haven't heard that acronym before, Black, Indigenous, people of color, might be seen as not meeting the standards of white culture if we have this sort of idea of what whiteness is as culture, and we see it on a hierarchy. So that's how that translates over. And I'm just going to look at a few aspects of what feeds into that. I like to think about this. I talk about it in terms of bias as white-mindedness. What do I mean by that? Like, we're just surrounded by a fog of being socialized into a society where ways that white people have done things are at the forefront, to the point where we don't really realize that we could do them differently. And so certain things emerge in that process. We're going to look just at 4 and then give a quick evaluation if you've seen it in your own work. And I will go through those now. So one barrier, one aspect of this is a fear of open conflict. What does that look like? So it's this idea that when someone raises an uncomfortable issue, and since I was sort of keeping it in the theme of where we're at, such as individual or systemic racism. So someone brings up the issue of healthcare disparities are a public health issue based on race. That's not that comfortable. For some people, the response might be to blame the person for raising the issue rather than to look at the issue that's actually causing the problem. So I don't know why so-and-so had to bring that up. We were having a good meeting, and then versus the points that were made. So to correct this, we need to be mindful that there's a difference between being polite and raising hard issues. Creighton has said we are an anti-racist institution. Our president has said that. When we don't see that happening, we should be talking about it. Are we? Do we have a fear of open conflict? So I'm just gonna put that out there. I have seen a fear of open conflict in my work in academic medicine at Creighton. Oh goodness, it didn't put my strongly agree, disagrees. You know what? I'm gonna then just go through it and have you think about that. I hope it didn't erase some of my options for the other ones. Option 2 is, if we're doing option 2 is agree, we could do it that way. How about we think about option 1 as option 2 is agree, option 3 is disagree, and we'll just leave off option 1. And then hopefully the other ones came through, but I'm nervous that something happened. It does not seem worth, however, exiting out of this. So I will just have you on the other ones. If it did this strange thing again, just go with it. Okay, defensiveness. What is the barrier of defensiveness? It's acts of self-protection in the form of righteous indignation or innocent victimhood in an attempt to ward off a perceived attack. What does that mean? So it serves as a barrier when people defend against charges of whatever ism, rather than examining how it might actually be happening. So if a practice starts to be introduced as racist and people respond with, I didn't choose to be white, I can't help what white people did in the past, all of those things, we maybe get defensive and don't really explore the issue that is at hand. So we want to try to resist urges to defend ourselves personally when systems are being questioned. The barrier of the right to comfort. What is this? It's the unspoken belief that certain people have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, which resists in scapegoating those who cause discomfort. What does that mean? So I put an example. Emerges when equating individual acts of unfairness against white people as being at the same level with everyday systemic racism targeting BIPOC people. So I will just tell you that when I go into trainings, I actually think about the comfort of white people and what I can say and what I can't say in terms of how it's going to go. The fact that I do that illustrates that at least in many places that I will train at in Nebraska, I assume that I'm going to get people that feel uncomfortable when I bring this up. And I try as best I can to train in a way that doesn't cause defensiveness because of this perceived right to comfort. Of course, the corollary to this is after this, right? Discomfort's at the root of all growth and learning, and we should welcome it as much as we can. But if we have this in our culture of academic medicine, we don't really question certain things because people think that they have a right to comfort and to not have to tread those difficult waters, to not have to ask those questions. It looks like it just kind of erased my strongly agree. So we'll go to the last one, either or thinking. What does that look like as a barrier? It's thinking where things are either or. So good, bad, us, them, right, wrong, makes it difficult to learn from mistakes or to work through conflict. And it results in trying to simplify complex things. Well, it's either this or this. Sometimes it's used by those who they want to sort of push something through and they're like, well, we have to choose A or B. And it doesn't let us think about all the complex options that we could put out there. It makes us sort of make a choice between A and B without acknowledging a need for more time, creativity to think of additional options. In white-minded thinking, a lot of times we have to pull ourselves from thinking in black and white to be comfortable with gray. That isn't always easy for some people. And so the sort of way to get around this one is to notice when people are using either or language and make a push to come up with more than two alternatives. And I might have created a word here with complexify, but complexify the issue, get it away from being simple. Additional white-mindedness barriers. So Tima Okun has a whole series that she has sort of accumulated through people thinking on this issue. And I wanted to put them here. They're all on that PDF that is on these slides and that we can put in the chat directly later during Q&A if we need to. But additional white-mindedness barriers, a sense of perfectionism and that things have to be just so, a sense of urgency that they need to be done now, a sense sometimes of quantity over quality. So it's more important that we get a lot of things done quickly, efficiency, sort of that push. Worship of the written word, this idea that if it's not in writing, it didn't happen, that there's only one right way to do things versus leaving space for many, many different ways to do things, including ways that we wouldn't do them ourselves if they get to the same goal. Paternalism and sort of having this sense of hierarchy over and, fatherly, motherliness towards those that we supervise. Power hoarding, I don't think I have to explain that one. Individualism that we have in our country in general. And I'm the only one who can do it. So like taking on sometimes a lot of things just because you think you're the only one who could do it right. The idea that progress means bigger and more. And objectivity. In some cultures, they would say, like, really, is anything as real or truthful as you say it is? Or is there more slippage there than we're willing to admit? So those are some ideas about barriers to teaching across identities. So how can we then have solutions? What can we do to improve our ability? And we're going to talk about that in terms of cultural humility in two ways. First of all, practicing interpersonal cultural humility and knowing ourselves. What sort of questions can we ask ourselves? So this was the definition that was offered in our first session about what cultural humility is. Describes a process in which individuals engage in self-reflection and self-critique related to cultural identity and awareness of the perspective of others. And I added that part in, including cultures of white-mindedness, with the primary goal of strengthening all. Another definition of cultural humility, the ability to maintain an other-oriented interpersonal stance in relation to aspects of social identities most important to the other person. So how can I be oriented towards you and interested in understanding of, mindful of your social and cultural identities? And we can think about cultural humility as having an intrapersonal and an interpersonal facet. What do I mean by that? Intrapersonal, what's going on in my own head? What's my own approach to this? It's an openness to accepting that our own social identities and experiences will limit our perspective and awareness in understanding the experiences of others. So I see things a certain way, not everyone does. And sometimes it's hard to break ourselves out of, not everyone does, right? Interpersonal, which we'll talk about with communication, that's the other-oriented stance where we are going to be open, show respect, consideration, humility, and interest regarding another's social identities and experiences. And so that really gets down to communication practices. And so as a communication professor, I will close with those. So practicing intrapersonal cultural humility. A lot of this is just questions to ask ourselves. And so you will have in the slide format these questions. How do my social identities and privileges limit my ability to see or understand lack of privilege and marginalization? I will just say to y'all right now that maybe until about 5 years ago, when I paid a lot more attention, I don't think I noticed in the ways that I should the representation of different racialized group within the faculty. And the fact that in arts and sciences, we are definitely a primarily white faculty. And then when I started paying attention, I noticed, right? But because of the fact that I came from that place and I wasn't paying that much attention, it limited my ability to see it. What are my gut reactions to others who have different backgrounds other than my own? And if my gut reaction is fear, how do I get myself past that? If my gut reaction is to place a hierarchy of human value, how do I get past that? How do I create space for or welcome people to explore their social identities related to academic medicine? And this one is so important that we're going to do it in Menti. How open am I to feedback about my level of cultural competence and cultural responsiveness? Yay, my things are back. I am open to feedback about my level of cultural competence and cultural responsiveness. So put yourself in this situation. Somebody comes up to you and says, you know, when you said blah, 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 it was kind of problematic. How do we do with that? I'm seeing lots of strongly agrees and agrees. That's great. Takes training to get ourselves there. This might be a hard one to have ourselves put, disagree. Maybe if I'd put neutral, we'd have some friends taking that space, but really think about that. And how do you, even if you are open, do you show that openness to others so that people would come forward when they have those sorts of concerns? Do you project that, right? As well as knowing that you're open to it. More on this idea, the intrapersonal. Brenda Allen has this book on difference and power that I use in my senior class. And I just love this so much that I wanted to include it. I've said before that everyone has bias. And so here's her perspective on it. Not do I have it, right? The question, I guess I have this on the second bullet. The question is not, am I biased? But instead, where do my biases come from and how do they show up? And so she says, how are my explicit and implicit biases? Remember, there's one we know we have, explicit, the ones we don't even know we have. Our fog of white-mindedness, implicit, impacting how I see my students and their social identity groups. How am I thinking under the influence, TUI? And I think some people maybe could see that as marginalizing, like an operating under the influence, but I actually think that I like using those words to show the serious consequences that can happen when we do think under the influence, right? I think we can point to many things in recent history of how when we think under the influence of our biases, it can lead to concrete life and death outcomes. Other questions we could ask ourselves. Do I ever, intentionally or unintentionally, make or allow statements that imply a best cultural group, a hierarchy of human value? Does ethnocentrism emerge in my thinking about students and their social identity groups? Does white ethnocentrism emerge in my thinking about students and their social identity groups? Do I evaluate people on white-minded sorts of standards? And then we could ask ourselves the questions about those 4 aspects of white-minded culture that I introduced. And remember, there were more than that. Do I have or project a fear of open conflict or defensiveness or right to comfort or either or thinking that might influence my teaching and learning environment? All questions to ask ourselves to better teach across social identities. And then the last sort of objective is then, what does that look like in terms of communication behaviors? How do I practice interpersonal cultural humility in communicating with others? So I often use this maxim that comes from a definition in communication by John Stewart that talks about interpersonal communication as maximizing the presence of the personal. And sort of you look at those 3 words, maximize, presence, personal. And this idea is how do, as much as is possible, right, within realms of the workday and appropriateness of teacher-student relationships and everything, but get to know people as individuals and not just in roles. And there are times I do this way better than others, right? The size of the class matters, whether or not students want to come see me in office hours matters, if I have just walking around time with them. Like, there are some spaces that make this easier than others, but how can I try to get to see people not just as roles, but as individuals? And some tips. When you first meet students, don't make assumptions about their social identities. We talked about that back with our iceberg. If we wouldn't want people to make assumptions about us, to not do the same. This does not mean that implicit biases are not going to cross our minds, okay? Like, I don't want to pretend that, because it's not true. Our brain categorizes things into schemas based on biases. But we, as human beings, have the agency and the cognitive ability to talk ourselves around that, right? I will share with you that I just turned 50, and for my 50th birthday, my ADL friends got me, I actually have a silk tank top that says, check yourself before you wreck yourself, Ice Cube. And they bought it for me because I use that in trainings all the time. We can't stop what years or decades or whatever of socialization sometimes comes into our head. We can't stop our brain before it starts to try to categorize, but we can then do a mental process to give a check to that, right? And certainly not have it be to the place where like we let those assumptions come out in interaction. Listen and ask questions to learn more about our students and remember what they say. So if they share something with us, we can use that later. That is maximizing the presence of the personal. Focus on a student's unique traits as opposed to their social identity groups. So we are going to notice social identities, and we may even not do them based on assumptions because we know people's social identities. But certainly if a student decides to reveal to me that they are LGBTQ+, I'm not just going to relate to them as an LGBTQ+ person because they have so many other facets of their identity. And this last one, I can't exactly tell you, right, how this would feel comfortable for you to say, but it's okay for you to acknowledge your unfamiliarity with their lived experiences alongside your commitment to empathizing with them. So to say, I am not a person of color, and I have never lived through some of the things that you've lived through, but I really do, want to understand as much as possible. Those sorts of things are okay to put out there because it's better than pretending that we do know if we don't. Practice micro inclusions. What do I mean by that? And I know microaggressions got addressed in session 1, so you know what those little acts of like cutting, right, with 1,000 little paper cuts look like. Micro inclusions are sort of the opposite. What are little symbolic acts of humanity, small, subtle words, phrases, and gestures that we can use in our interactions to help encourage others to feel comfortable, heard, seen, and respected, rather than the opposite? And I gave you some examples. Verbally, self-introduce with your pronouns. And I guess I renamed myself with those. I didn't self-introduce, often I do. Remembering names and pronouncing them correctly. That can certainly be a big one when we have a lot of diverse groups together. It's important that we call people by the name that they want to be called by and that we do it correctly. Letting someone finish their sentence. I know that sounds small. It doesn't always happen. Using inclusive language. I have probably said y'all multiple times without realizing it. I say y'all not because I'm from the South, I'm from Mason City, Iowa, but because I do not say you guys, and that's an intentional choice. Non-verbally, making eye contact, smiling, paying attention to someone talking, leaning forward, not shying away, all just small little ways that we could show inclusion. So, couple more ideas. What are other micro-inclusions you can think of in a teaching and learning environment? Other ways that we could just show inclusion. And even if it's just a couple words. Because there's always more wisdom in the room than I have on my own. Acknowledging that not everyone celebrates, yes, insert mainstream holiday here. Allowing others to lead, using diverse images or examples, illustrations that include different races. Awesome. Diversity in class examples, diversity in authors. Yes. And I think that allowing others to lead, offer various ways to participate, listening, awesome. Allowing others to lead, thinking about, am I the right person to take this space? Or should I be having someone else do it? All amazing ways to think about micro-inclusions, asking about others' cultures. Don't one up others. Share leadership. Absolutely. Yes. Make sure there's no one else going to hit enter. But these are all awesome ways to think about how it can look different. How we can think about, I want to center micro-inclusions, and then hopefully, we have to respond to microaggressions if they happen. But if we're centering micro-inclusions, it's going to put us in a frame where they're much less likely to happen. Other ways to practice interpersonal cultural humility, being ready to respond and speak up to behaviors in the teaching and learning environment that seem discriminatory or inappropriate. including they, them, and we, us language. Like whenever I hear you people, I just go, oh gosh, how are we going to recover from that, right? How do we respond? And how do we respond rather than react? Because if we react like super aggressively, that doesn't have us have a good teaching and learning environment either, right? We know that regardless of intent, some behaviors can have a negative impact, and they're going to require a dialogue about impact and intent. So I just had a question here, and then I'm going to give you a couple strategies. I feel prepared to intervene and speak up when there are discriminatory or inappropriate comments in my academic medicine environment. How do y'all feel on that one? Do you feel ready to respond? And if you don't, it's okay. And these, of course, are all impacted by power dynamics and things too, right? Like a med student might be willing to say something to another med student, but not to their, supervising physician, those sorts of things. Okay. I'm going to give you just a couple things that I think are super ADL tippy, quick and dirty ways to do this. One of my favorite and easiest ways to intervene is when someone says something, if you just simply say, what did you mean by that? And you literally just put it out as a question with no tone, that person has to look internally to say, what did I mean by that? And they asked me a question. So now I have to actually, through talking this out, illustrate how my behavior was problematic. That is one of my favorite ones. Ouch is one that can be like just a quick and dirty one. If that works for you, you can sort of think about multiple ways, right? And I have at least 6, and if people are interested, I will send off the way that I train students and people in the community to respond, and we can talk about it a little more in the question and answer. But what did you mean by that? I feel like is my favorite one by a mile. And you all started to lay some of these things out. We practice interpersonal cultural humility in terms of the communication of the ways that our teaching practices come across too. So do those need to be adapted? Think about our pedagogical content and if there are ways to reflect the different social identities of our students. Be open to students' reactions to course material. So if they're reacting to it, and we said that we could be open to maybe observations on our cultural competence, model an acceptance and appreciation for different ideas, opinions, and learning styles. To get out of this, there's only one way to do things. Be careful not to respond to comments in ways students might interpret as dismissive, and examine course content for inaccurate information, absent narratives, and questionable portrayals of certain groups. So I did 4 things here, at least off the top of my head, ways we can adapt. And I want just really quickly, which of these ideas about adapting teaching practices seems most relevant to you and your teaching? And it'll just send a dot once you hit enter to one of those. Thank you. Whichever one you put, I want to challenge you to keep it in your mind after this session when you are getting things ready for next semester. Like, are there things that you could do that to keep this practice at the forefront of your mind? I reproduced this slide from session 1 because it just sort of put out there, what are lots of ways that we can communicate cultural humility and these communication practices that show inclusion. Challenge the idea, not the person, listen, know that people are experts on their own opinion, own experience, consider being wrong, do not overshare, call in rather than call out, don't steer the conversation to your viewpoint. That goes back to some white-mindedness, know when to condemn and when to just open up. There are some times, right, where saying, what did you mean by that is not okay, and you've got to just address it in the moment. pause to process, mobilize the power of empathy, and share responsibility. And so with that, I am open and available for questions. And I'll make it so I can see lots of faces at once.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirby. You have really helped us think about how open is our mind and how do we assimilate different social identities, different from our own. So I really appreciate your wisdom. Please, if you have any questions, put it in the chat. Or you can just unmute yourself and turn your video on, and we welcome live questions as well.
And I'll stop sharing momentarily, and then I'll put up the continuing ed sort of credit at when it gets a little bit closer to 2.
Perfect.
And let me look in the chat now. Okay. Oh, and I see Jessica, you already put that in there as well.
Yes, I thought I just added a couple different places. So either way.
You are so welcome, everyone. I apologize for I don't know what Menti did to those 4 questions, but I trust that you were reflecting on them.
It's all right. We figured it out.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
This is Raduga. I would love to learn those 6 topics that you have, how to be able to handle sometimes. If you don't mind emailing, and I'll be happy to share with others too. I think those tools are really important.
I am happy to share those because I do think that sometimes we know we're supposed to say something and it seems so intimidating that we don't always do that, even knowing that maybe we should. So happy to do that. And I will just,
Dr. Kirby, I can add them to the follow-up email where I share the slides. So I'll make sure and wait for those before I email that out.
That sounds great. And I'll just really super quickly run through them, the 6 that I trained through, and then I'll send you more information. The first one is to assume good intent and explain impact. And that's if you feel like you can put good intent on it, right? Because sometimes we're like, that couldn't have come from a place of good intent. But sometimes people something comes out and you're like, I don't think they meant for it to come out that way. So I know you didn't mean anything by that. But sometimes if we use the word Indian, blah, 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 or something, right? I feel like, there are still some spaces where there's room to suggest new language. And that's a way to do that. Asking a question, what did you mean by that? Interrupt and redirect, something like, oh, let's not go there. Something brought into universal human behavior is the 4th. So that would be like, well, Justin just does, and I'm going to be stereotypical on purpose. So please bracket this. Justin is just so cheap because he's Jewish. And then saying, well, don't you think everyone appreciates their money and wants to spend it well, right? So I'm taking that's just a universal trait. Making it individual is the opposite. Like someone will say, all insert cultural groups here does whatever. And you'll say, well, do you really think everyone does that? Or are you speaking of someone in particular? And then it makes them question how they stereotyped an entire cultural group and then saying ouch. So those are the 6, but I will make sure to send them as well. The questions, comments, concerns, things I can help with?
I was
so worried about getting done in time. So whew. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Your presentation was so wonderful. I was hoping we could invite you again for our learners to listen in as well, residents and medical students in the future.
I would be happy to if this was helpful.
Thank you.
You bet.
Very helpful.
Well, Jessica, do you want me to put up the slide or do you feel like since it was in chat, we're all okay?
I think let's go ahead and put the slide up.
Okay, perfect.
And even though it's kind of quiet, we still can take questions. So
absolutely.
We've ended a little early on purpose so that we can get some questions in. Lots of thank yous, lots of great presentation. I echo.
I'm just going to go ahead just so you, if anybody needs me individually. I mean, not that we can't find each other easily on campus, but there's my email.
Email. What's the fastest way to do this? Is texting or email better, or which do you think?
Rosanna, you're on. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I'm trying to see continuing education credit. So what's the best way to get your certificate?
You can do either way. You can do the website, or you can do it on your phone if you've already signed
Yeah,
up.
I think I'm gonna do it.
You do already need to have an account with CME Tracker, so you may do the website.
Yeah, I gotta go to the website because I don't have that. Okay, thank you.
So one of the comments, Dr. Kirby, that I think is so true is someone put so many things we can put to use right away. And I think that is so true, that there are things that can happen right now, today, as we're with learners and our peers and our colleagues, that we can change our behavior right away. It's not something that's really hard. It's not, although it does take some practice, it's something we can use right away.
Definitely. I think all of these things we can, keeping them at the forefront of our minds is the hard part, right? So if nothing else, if you take away, check yourself before you wreck yourself, we're in good shape.
All right, we're just about 5 minutes to the hour, so we're going to go ahead and close up. Lots of great comments, but I didn't see any other questions. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Kirby, for your time, sharing of your time, sharing your wisdom, and sharing things that we can do to really assimilate these new behaviors into the way we do things.
You are so welcome.